Everybody, welcome back to Clutch the Moment podcast. As always, I'm your host, David Steinhauer. Tonight we're talking with Katie Blaylock of the YouTube channel Vintage and Vinyl. I met with her because I was trying to figure out what the draw was. Why do people get so excited about collecting vintage? Is it the way they're made, the better quality, the heft, the feel? Is it the fact that somebody cared? Is it the fact that they've survived so long and they have stories to tell? Come along with us and we'll find out on this episode of Clutch the Moment podcast. And we are going to talk about Katie's hobby, one of a few. As you can see around us, Katie collects all different kinds of vintage.
I do, and I'm thrilled to be here, David, with you.
Yeah, we've actually had a bunch of good chats in the last couple days. I really appreciated you coming out to Art in Motion, where I used to work, and taking a look at some of the fun cars we have. And now I get to see part of your world, which is really fun.
Well, it was so much fun going to Art in Motion because David really brought that to life, and there's so many cool cars. I've driven by that building, for a long time in St. Augustine and never really knew what it was. So it was just fantastic to get to go in. And I'm glad David gets to come here and see kind of my wonderful and interesting world of vintage advertising and collections here.
Right. What started your love of vintage?
That is a good question. And I can tell you the moment that I fell in love with vintage. It was at the Fernandina Shrimp Festival. My mom is an anchor reporter here in town, and she would have to work the First Coast News booth. And so when I was a kid, Mom would take us along, and she would let us, as we got older, kind of wander off to a few of the vendors. So they have art, they have antiques, they have all kinds of things at this place. And there was an antique row, is what everybody called it, right behind where my mom had to be stationed at this booth to sign autographs and talk to people. And she would give me maybe $10 or $20 and tell me, go have fun. So I'd go down the antique row, and I was enamored by the Coca-Cola bottles. And that's what I started collecting, was fun Coca-Cola things. And back then, you could pick up Coca-Cola bottles for maybe $2 or $3. You know, some of the ones that are more common. And I would just have so much fun shopping that little row of antiques. And I just fell in love with collecting vintage.
That's amazing. What age would you say that was?
It's probably 6, 7.
Wow.
You know, probably closer to 7, I would say, when Mom would let us go off kind of, by ourselves. So
Right.
We weren't far from
Yeah.
her, but it was a lot of fun getting to see all the antiques. And they had a lot of dealers that just had all kinds of interesting things. And advertising was a big item in that antique row. And I just fell in love with all the graphics and the colors and the things that we don't see now in stores.
Right. So how long were you on your Coca-Cola kick? First off, were you kind of exclusively focusing on that kind of stuff at that time? Or was it just what happened to be in your price range at the time?
It was all Coca-Cola. I think Coca-Cola too was quite interesting to me because growing up, my mom really didn't let us have a lot of soda. My dad did in the summer, and Coke was always something my dad had. And to me, that was a special treat. It was an exciting thing that we got to do in the summer, And then when I got to collecting Coca-Cola, I think that was just kind of a natural brand I gravitated towards, of course. But the Coca-Cola advertising in general, just out of all the vintage advertising, is some of the most iconic and well-known and interesting advertising, I think. Their graphics are just so incredible.
Yeah, extremely effective.
Very.
So do you think Coca-Cola is a gateway drug for a lot of people? Or, and I didn't mean that pun, but I'm glad that it came out. We can enjoy it. But, I feel like because it's so iconic, because it's pretty accessible, because, to your point, there's a fair amount of affordability even today. Would you say that that's kind of, everybody's first stab into vintage, or do you see people gravitate toward other things?
I think it's kind of a mix, and that's a very interesting question, David. I mean, a lot of people start collecting things, either they saw something in an antique mall that caught their eye, or they were really interested in a particular type of collection because their grandparents collected it. Maybe they went over to their grandparents' house and always admired their collection of Fenton glass or milk glass or any type of collection. But I do think Coca-Cola in the world of advertising is more accessible. There's definitely some rare Coca-Cola pieces, things that you're not going to find, but you see Coca-Cola bottles everywhere. You can go to any antique mall and primarily some vendor is going to have a Coca-Cola bottle. So I think it's really easy for people to start collecting. And you do find a lot of Coca-Cola pieces that have been reproduced, so people might get into some of the 70s Coca-Cola reproductions because they're just cheap and they're everywhere.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So then what was next? What came next after Coca-Cola, and what made you branch out?
That's a good question. I kind of fell in love after that, going from kind of a different type of area of collecting with brooches. My grandmother gave me her poodle brooch. It was a Boucher brooch. It's spelled like Boucher, but it's pronounced Boucher. And I fell in love with that little poodle, and I wore it everywhere. And people would stop me in the stores and say, "Oh my gosh, where did you get that? I don't see people wearing brooches." And I said, "Well, my grandma gave it to me." And I just sort of went down this rabbit hole of, I could wear a different, fun little piece of vintage every day. It's something I could actually take with me. I can't, carry around my tens or, different pieces of my collections all day. But a little brooch, I can always wear that on my shirt. And it kind of brings vintage with me where I go, which is also a great conversation piece. So I started after the Coca-Cola with brooches, and then I started finding other advertising, and my world just expanded, and I fell in love with Tobacciana and Petroliana, and it's just expanded from there. I really focus on the advertising that has a lot to do with more mechanics or interesting things. I'm not so much into kitchen tins per se. There's a whole collectability world there of people that like kitchen tins and things like that, and I gravitate more towards items that were more, they all had a purpose. That's what I like about collecting tins.
Right.
They were something that were meant to, meant to be thrown away, and now, all these years later, people are appreciating the art and the design of them. But I really like the oil cans. I like the tobacco tins, as you're seeing behind me.
Yeah.
And I just love all those types of things.
Yeah, it is really impressive, some of the pieces you have here. And it is so interesting to hear you talk about, the function behind a lot of these pieces. How much do you think people were aware back then that they were designing something that had lasting appeal? Like, to me, if you threw a design up and it caught eyes in the moment, that's, then your work is done. But some of these designs are iconic and lasting, and they stick around, so do you have any thoughts about that?
That's a very interesting point. And with tobacco tins, I think you brought up a very good point. The main purpose of all the different designs and graphics on the tobacco tins was simply to catch people's eye in a general store or a pharmacy, because there were so many, literally thousands of brands of tobacco, that you needed something that was going to stand out and catch people's eye. But with other types of tins, they had kind of an interesting function. And typewriter tins is another area of tins that I collect. I don't have my display here, but I do in my office. And what's kind of neat about those is they actually designed them for people to reuse them, because they wanted the little containers to be reused. So one of the tins that I have has pictures of paper clips and fishing lures and staples and earrings, because they thought that the secretaries could reuse them. In a lot of cases, that's why those tins survived, is because they were sitting in a desk. Someone thought, this is a great little container to corral small objects.
Right.
And I think that's interesting. Tobacco tins, yes, you could store something in them, but some of them, particularly the vertical pocket tins, that's what we call this style that you're seeing behind me here, they really can't store a whole lot, maybe screws or something in the garage, but the little typewriter tins I think were more practical for the lasting ability of the tin itself. Oil cans, they really can't be reused. I mean, you could put maybe other oil in it, but a lot of times those get kind of thrown away over the years because they had just one purpose and they weren't a container that you could store stuff in. You see a lot of containers at thrift stores that might have sewing things in them because, of course, you know, people would save that cookie tin and put all of their sewing notions inside. So some tins did have a lasting effect because they were a practical item within the home.
That's brilliant. And I mean, so unheard of in today's extremely stripped down, you know,
throwaway society.
Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't think of reusing the blow moly like clear plastic that everything comes in today, right? There's no function there.
But these,
right, exactly. But these have an immediate reuse and not just hopefully recycle. So that's interesting. And I mean, what better way to make sure that your brand is in the forefront of people's mind is when they reach for a fishing lure or whatever, they think about your typewriter company, you know, hey, it's the weekend, but guess what? On Monday morning, you're going to see us again, you know?
Yep.
It's
and
brilliant.
You're going to think about, you know, ordering that typewriter tin again because you're going to see it and you say, okay, now I need to order more of them because I'm using this as a container for something else.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a level of forethought that's really, really telling. So what makes, oh my gosh, what makes thoughts go straight out of my head? So I'm fascinated by the effort that goes into just these tins and other very simple things, and a lot of that is due to, you know, that was the mindset. Just build it as good as you can build it, right? The longevity is a main selling feature of whatever it is, even if it's just the packaging. So, you know, how does that kind of lend itself to the culture of collecting and stuff like that?
Well, I think that's a great point because things back then were just well made. They were made to last. A perfect example of that is I have an old record that features Westinghouse wash machines. And on the record, it's a service record, and you would get a lot of these promotional records with different items you would buy, and they would give you maybe instructions, or some of them were just fun little jingles that you could shave to while you were actually using your Remington shaver. But this particular record really fascinated me because it talked about if you need service on your Westinghouse washer, you can contact Sears in 10 years, and we will service this machine, no questions asked. Now, think about this in today's world, right? There is no 10 years from now with a product, for the most part. You know, companies kind of design things now to be used, and then they have a shelf life. That gets you to buy more items. We're always throwing away. We're a disposable society, but in the world of collecting, a lot of times things have stuck around because they're so well made. I happen to have my great-grandmother's 1916 Singer sewing machine. It's a red eye. It was one of the best models at the time that you could buy. And that machine still works today from 1916. That is just incredible to me, but that speaks to its quality and the way that people built things then. It was made to last. That good old American manufacturing. I mean, you just can't beat it.
Right.
And that helps a lot of us collectors today because things have survived.
Yeah, definitely. It really is a testament to how much people cared, right? Nobody was phoning it in, you know, at the Singer plant. They were proud to be making the world's best sewing machines to them, right? And yeah, that's really fascinating. And I find this interesting interplay between the time period where things got standardized and tools and manufacturing became a lot more standardized, structured, precise. But there's a grace period between when things got precise and before they started cheapening, right? There's like this magical little window where things were high quality, but they were also made with somewhat modern tooling and equipment. I just love stuff from that era, whether that be tools, whether that be just general household items. It's kind of the peak, because we have maybe better technology today, but we don't care like we used to care. And before that time period, they put their heart and soul into it, but it was handmade. There's no, the measuring devices and stuff were not as developed back then. So is there like particular time periods or grace periods with different categories of vintage that kind of lend themselves, or like what's the peak of different types of vintage collecting to you?
That's quite interesting, and a lot of people collect different eras and different things that they're most interested in. Some people really love the early 1800s type of antiques. Some people love 1950s. Some people remember the 70s fondly, and they love collecting 70s stuff. It just depends what you want to collect. But I do think certain eras of vintage do have a time period in which they are best. Fostoria glass is one of the other things that I have a mini collection of. And I think that there definitely is a good time period for Fostoria glass. I'll give you a great example. Fostoria made coin glass, which has little coin motifs. Actually, U.S. glass made that first, and then the U.S. government banned that because they were actually using real molds of coins.
Oh my gosh.
And it was considered counterfeit. So
wow.
the government said, nope, you can't do that. And they said, well, no one's going to break the mold to try to spin this glass coin, but that didn't matter. And then come years later into the 1950s, we have Fostoria making coin glass with not real money motifs.
Right.
And of course, they made wonderful glass. But then in the 1970s, Lancaster Colony got their molds, which is a common theme in glass. Companies decide that they're no longer going to be in business, or they go under. Their molds get sold, another company buys them and starts manufacturing that mold, which does make it extremely difficult for collectors that want true originals. But Lancaster Colony made the coin glass in the 70s, I believe through the 80s, if I've got my dates right on that. And their coins are just terribly done. The coins on the glass itself are actually sandblasted as opposed to the true original acid wash technique that Fostoria used. Now in the 60s, the government did ban acid washing for some reason, and of course
maybe
Fostoria...
environmental?
Yes, possibly. Fostoria did have to switch to sandblasting, but they did a good job. The coin detail was wonderful in the glass. So it was a pressed piece of glass, but then they would use the sandblasting to get that detail of the coin. When Lancaster Colony Company started doing it, the frosting's totally just gone. You can't see the details. Sometimes you can't even tell what the coin is supposed to have on it, which is typically, I believe, the Liberty Bell, and then the Statue of Liberty, and then it's got another motif. So that, to me, kind of speaks to there are certain eras that are better because, Lancaster Colony glass, not that great. But then you have Fostoria True Original Coin, 50s, that's the best era for that particular item. So it really does depend on the item in which you're talking about.
That's fascinating. And I imagine, even today there are companies that will reproduce stuff on the same molds, but because the molds have worn, or, the drill bits are less sharp or whatever, you get a much less sharp product. It's inferior in all kinds of ways, because even though it's the exact same design, it may even be the exact same mold, it's just not been changed out very often. You start to get imperfections there. So it's interesting to hear that even back in the day, the same mold can produce two very different levels of quality.
It certainly can. And molds wear out, over time, but they do last a very long time before they have to be switched.
Sure. Yeah. That's fascinating. Collecting my thoughts. So, let's see, something you said was really fascinating to me. Glass molds. We were talking about, oh yeah. Okay, so next question is, do you think there's a minimum age for something to be considered vintage?
Yes, I do. And this is highly debated within our vintage community. Of course, Etsy definition of vintage is 10 years.
That's pretty generous, I would say.
I think so. So I'm kind of in a different viewpoint. I think anything 20 years and older is vintage. Of course, anything 100 years and older is antique. But I don't yet consider the 90s vintage. Now, I know a lot of people are going to probably come at me for that. The 90s, I mean, yes, it's, a long time ago. But it's not 1950s vintage. It's not 1930s vintage.
Sure.
And now, of course, I think the 20s at least are becoming now over 100 years old. So, I mean, there's a lot of time frames that are different to different people. But to me, when you start saying vintage 90s, it's like, I don't know that I can really get behind that.
Sure. I wouldn't call a 1992 Ford Taurus a vintage car, for example.
No, that's just my 2 cents. But, everybody has their different definitions. It's very similar to the whole made in Japan and occupied Japan debate, the dates on when those things actually were marked, stamped in pieces of porcelain and different collectors' items from, that time frame. A lot of people debate on those dates, and it's the same thing.
Makes sense. So the reason I ask is because, I'm very curious about what makes something feel old. What makes something feel like vintage? And I bring up that Ford Taurus as an example of a car that doesn't have, when you sit in the driver's seat, everything is as you'd expect it, right? Cars leaving the showroom today have the same pedals, steering wheel, everything is standardized. And functionally, you can go across the country in a Ford Taurus. So there's no overt thing that communicates its age. And I think even the materials of construction or that kind of thing, there hasn't been a big difference, a notable difference. Cars these days have much more technology, whatever. But, cars of the 90s, a lot of them had more technology than a Ford Taurus as well. So what is it for you that makes something feel vintage? Like, is it just the date period, or is there other, like, more qualitative things that to you are like, oh, this, has a story maybe?
Yeah, to me, it's the history of an item. Yes, you could say that I know for a fact that this is from 1932. That is wonderful, but I kind of want to know the story about it. The story. How did you come into this item? How did you get it? Where did it come from originally? What was its purpose? I like researching and learning all of those things. So I guess that helps make an item feel vintage, but also the quality and the design and the graphics of an item. For me, looking at these old tins, when you pick up something like this here, obviously, this is not something from anywhere near the last 10 years. This is probably from 1890. It's just amazing, the graphics and design on something like this. And this was a time when people actually put their product on the side, and they were proud to display all of the details about the product and, of course, the manufacturing plant. This just feels vintage. Also, sometimes it's a smell. Vintage has a very interesting smell. An old metal has just the most wonderful smell. It reminds me of being in an old hardware store, and that, to me, makes me extremely happy. It makes me feel like something's truly vintage.
Yeah, I don't know if it's that oxidation or what have you, but there's definitely a quality to, this item, whatever it is, has stood the test of time. It's really cool.
And the weight too. You know, certain items have a real weight to them. Old lamps are heavy. You can feel that cast iron base. You know, old radios definitely have some heft, even though they might be plastic. You know, old bottles are thick. Good old Fostoria glass has a very thin texture. You know, it's thin in design and lightweight. So all of the items are kind of different in their design and their textures and their colors and their smells, but it all kind of adds to making it be vintage.
Right. And we come back to the cost cutting or the lack thereof in vintage. I mean, that the solid feel of extra steel or even plastic being used in a product back then was no big deal. That was a plus. That was like, oh, this feels sturdy. Now we're doing everything we can to trim 1/4 of a gram off of, you know, whatever it is. And even back to the advertising, we have distilled, I mean, TikTok's a perfect example of this. We've distilled what will grab your attention in 2 seconds or less, right? And it's a race to the bottom. It's decontenting, you know, as much as possible and just kind of flashing something at you. But no, this is a book. You could read this tin. You spend 5 minutes to read this tin fully. Like it's very detailed.
On the side. It's crazy.
Yeah, and the typeface of everything is good. The color choice of everything is so good. It's just, they did not care what effort it took to make that happen. They were going to execute that to a high level. And yeah.
And it fascinates me that they put so much detail into one small tin. Somebody had to design that. Right. And it had a purpose. It wasn't, you know, oh, let's just make this pretty. It was, let's make this product stand out. And let's make the best product that we can. And every little tin has some of the coolest graphics from back in the day. And I walk up and down our cereal aisle now, and I look at some of the cereal boxes, and I think, man, this is boring. Nothing against our graphic designers now. There's a lot of talented people. But it's just our advertising just, I'm sorry, pales in comparison to the advertising that you see from back in the day, because it's so detailed, so intricate, and that offset lithography is just gorgeous.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like styling of cars right now has gotten so uniform because they're all chasing the same standards and they're all, you know, copying off of each other's notes, frankly. And I don't think they're being lazy, but it's a perfect example of like, well, when you're cutting costs so hard and when you're not really interested in doing something that stands out, like you always arrive at the same conclusion anyway. So yeah, it's really disappointing.
I always say that every white SUV looks like every other white SUV in a parking lot. I mean, they're all the same. There's no individuality or uniqueness to any particular car.
Right. You have to spend so much money these days to buy something new that actually says something about your personality, because everything is straight off of Amazon and it's copies of each other because that's the most efficient way, you know. And vintage stuff has a very distinct flavor, right? Even Tobacania or any of that kind of stuff, it's all got a very specific vibe that designer or that brand is putting out, and you know, it can say so much. So talk to me about the kinds of people you've met while on your vintage quest, and you know what their collections say about them.
That is a wonderful point. I have met some incredible people just finding a shared love of vintage and antiques. People that I never would have thought that I met would meet. One of my best friends now lives in New Zealand, Nate. I met him through one of our...
Shout out to Nate.
Yeah, Nate.
You're talking to me about your friend Nate who collects, what was it?
Wedgwood. So Wedgwood is a brand for everyone that's not familiar with it. They have a famous Wedgwood blue. They made trinket dishes and ginger jars and all kinds of little things. I also believe they made a series of plates. Nate will probably correct me if I'm wrong. But he collects sterling silver and Wedgwood, among other things. And those are two things that I necessarily don't collect. But we kind of formed our bond over our love of collecting and always trying to find the next best piece for our collections. And we both love to cook, so we've done several cooking segments on my channel together, which really don't involve vintage, but we have a lot of fun doing it. And I met Nate in this chat, and he's from New Zealand, and I just think that's so cool that I've met this guy that lives all the way in New Zealand, and we talk quite a bit online. So the internet can be a really good thing, and when you find people in a community that collect even different things, but they all love collecting and vintage, you kind of come together and you meet some really neat people. And I've met people here locally. You know, it's kind of fun. You go to these antique stores and you find that this one particular vendor might sell a whole bunch of something you collect. So then you meet that person and you get to talk with them, and they've maybe collected for longer than you have.
Right, and they have the exact same sickness as you.
Yes, it's wonderful. I just met this lady. Her name's Denise. I've been shopping from her booth for, 3 years now maybe. She has all brooches in this particular booth at one of my local antique malls. She has some of the best Austrian crystal brooches, just stuff we don't see here in the States very often. And I told the people at the front, you know, one day I would just love to meet this lady, because I've been buying from her for years. And I finally got to meet Denise, and she's the most delightful lady, but she travels all the way to England to source her brooches. I believe she even might go to the Paris flea markets. She goes all over and finds just the most unique things and brings it back. And I had just a delightful conversation with her about her love of collecting, and she said, I just try to find the most unique things people aren't going to walk into an antique mall and see every day. And I just thought that was so neat, getting to share that love of vintage. And the cool thing is, and she knows now that I love brooches, and so she's actually going to loan me some of her research books. So you connect with people that way too. You know, you kind of, there is some competition in trying to sell items, obviously, because we're all selling items as well as collecting. But for the most part, we're all helping each other out. You know, we know this person collects this, so now we're all on the lookout for this item for this person that we met. Or, you know, we all are trying to research something, so we might say, oh, you know, this person knows a lot about these particular items in the vintage world. You know, I don't know a lot about Lefton ceramics, but this person does, so I might email them and say, hey, I found this, do you know anything about it? Right. And you'd be surprised. They'd get their research books out and they'll take pictures and they'll say, yeah, this is so-and-so made at this time. So you connect with people in a lot of different ways, and it's just wonderful. You meet some of the neatest people through collecting, and you share sort of a bond of always trying to pick up the next treasure for your collections.
Right. Yeah, you build your network.
And I think, too, that this is the only community that truly understands collecting. You know, a lot of times you meet other people that don't collect, and they don't understand the collecting mentality of like, where am I going to put that? Like, that's really cool, but I'm running out of room, and I have to have it, though. So then, you know, all of us collectors that deal with that, we all talk about how, oh, well, we moved this, and we found the perfect spot for that one item that we just had to have. You know, but other people that don't collect, they don't quite understand the thrill of that next item. Like, you know, you might have a holy grail vintage list, that white whale that you're always looking for, and other collectors can kind of relate to that, and they can relate to the joy of finding things and also sometimes having too many things.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually kind of where my next question was headed. So do you still have those Coca-Cola bottles that got you into it all those years ago?
I have some. You know, you have to kind of hone down your collections. When you get into collecting, you might collect something for a while and then kind of, you know, get tired of it. Of course, I'm never going to tire of my vintage advertising. That's just a real love and passion of mine. And the graphics just make me so happy. But Coca-Cola has so many neat things to collect. I mean, they made thousands and thousands of products.
Yeah.
They even have a sandwich press that's very rare, but it pressed their logo into the sandwich, and then at the diner, when the person handed you the sandwich, it says Coca-Cola, and they, of course, come up and say, what do you want to drink with your sandwich? Well, right there, I want a Coke. I mean, just the amount of clever advertising Coke has is amazing, but you kind of have to be selective because you can't collect it all. Unless you're Alan Petretti, who wrote this wonderful guidebook on Coca-Cola, who literally has a museum of the rarest of rare in the Coca-Cola world. He's a fascinating guy. But I kind of was more selective as I got into the hobby. And I said, okay, I really like the Coca-Cola trays, the serving trays, and I don't like the reproductions, and I don't like the modern ones. So I'm only going to collect the trays from 1900 to like 1950. And then that way I kind of limit myself to a smaller group, and I don't have so much, you know, but I have a really good collection. And my friend Nate kind of is under the mindset that you kind of search for the best items in the collection, and I think that's a good way to go too. So I do have some of the bottles. You can see them up here. But I don't have all of them. I kind of like the bottles that are a little bit older than some of the newer bottles, so I got rid of some of those, and I now have these. And the great thing about being a collector and a reseller is you can collect something for a while, and if you get tired of it or you decide that, yeah, that doesn't really work with what I'm collecting, you just sell it. So it's wonderful. It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I think I keep referring to Jerry Seinfeld because he's just the most prolific collector probably in the car world, at least between the combination of he's such a diehard nerd and he's got a lot of public presence as well. And he says that a collection breathes. It expands and it contracts, and it expands and it contracts. And you'll know you're headed in the right direction when you're condensing upward. When you're keeping the things that bring you more joy and letting what doesn't bring you more joy find another owner and another person that it will. So that's really fascinating to hear that you've gone through some of those iterations and that the collection is always changing.
It is. I think advertising in its core will always be something that stays in my home. And my tobacco tin, some of these are quite hard to find. And so I don't think I'll ever get rid of those. Those are just those pieces that you are going to love forever. But there's other pieces that you get that you think, okay, I'll probably like this for a while, and then you'll pass it along. And that's just fine. And the neat thing about that is you get the opportunity to learn about different types of vintage. For me, for a while, I had a bunch of different depression glass because I wanted to learn the patterns. And then I learned the patterns, not all of them because there's quite a few, but I would learn the patterns, I'd study them, and then I'd say, okay, I've had this piece a while, I'm going to hone it down to a more harder to find piece, and I'm going to sell this piece. But the good thing about that is I got to learn. And so that's kind of cool too. You learn about things and then you move it along and then you find something else really cool. And the running joke within our community though is always, I don't need another collection. And of course that's a problem when you start watching other people in the vintage world. They might show something and you're like, man, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And now I want to collect that. And just yesterday I sent one of my friends in the vintage world a post of a guy that collects antique medical slides, but they're not just plain glass slides. They all have these beautiful type fonts on them. And I thought, oh man, those are so cool, and I might need to start that collection, but it's like, I can't.
Right. I love that you treat it as like an excuse to educate yourself about something though. Like that's the right mindset. I definitely do that with cars too. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm a deep dive on, whatever car I end up buying and fixing up and flipping, because I can't keep everything forever. And certainly cars are hard to store.
You can't just have 10 of them.
No, it's really hard to even have 2 of them right now. I'm really suffering, but first world problems. But there is a natural, desire to say, okay, what's next? in terms of both what's next in the things I do collect, or what's that white whale, and also what's the next category, or what else might catch your fancy as you broaden and not just deepen. Do you have any pieces that you really chased down or hunted down that you did catch that white whale?
I do have quite a few. In the world of tins, it's kind of interesting. Some tins are very common, particularly with tobacco tins. You'll find Sir Walter Raleigh, your half and half, the old, did you let Prince Albert out of the can joke. You'll find those tins pretty much everywhere because they were such a big brand and they made so many of them. When you get into tins like the Times Square, the Globe, or the Honeymoon, you're not going to find those every day, and they're very expensive. That's the one thing about advertising, is it's out of all the things that you can collect, they're pretty up there in price. Not everything is expensive. You can start finding the Sir Walter Raleighs and some of those other tins for $10 or $12, but when you get into some of them, the more interesting and more graphically cool tins, you're going to find that they're more expensive and harder to find. So these definitely I've traced down, but the coolest thing is I met a guy, this goes back to your meeting neat people through this hobby, is I met a guy named Peter. He lives all the way in England. His account is called Hud's Curios. He takes pictures of tins in the Cotswolds outside with his little dog. He's just delightful. And I fell into the world of collecting British Tobacconiana through him because I did not know these tins existed because we don't have them here in the States. And I started buying from him, and he found this scissors tin for me. It is a very hard tin to find. I saw it in an advertising book, and I knew I had to have it, but I had looked and looked online, and if you do find an example, I think one was listed on eBay for like $1,000.
Holy smokes.
For that little tiny tin. It's crazy. And so I emailed Peter one day, and I said, hey, if you ever find the scissors tin, will you give me a holler? And a few months went by, and I got this message from Peter that says, I think I found something you might really like. And I said, ooh, I wonder what that is. And I had totally forgotten that I had put, I knew I was looking for this tin. You're always kind of looking for things. But he sent me a picture. He says, would you like this? And I said, yes, I would. And he gave me a great deal on it. And I just was thrilled to find it all the way from England. So some of these have come from England. The other cool thing that I kind of accidentally traced down is this parking meter up here on the top of my bookcase. I actually wasn't looking for that. It found me. I was in an antique store in St. Augustine, and I saw that parking meter, and I thought, I have got to have that. That is just the coolest, most unique thing. And so it was $350. So I went up to the front, and I figured that was a pretty fair price for parking meters because, when are you going to see a parking meter? So I looked it up on eBay, and the solds for that particular model seemed like that was in line with exactly what they should be going for.
Right. Really quick life hack. Go on eBay. Forget Amazon because Amazon sucks. Go on eBay and click the sold items checkbox on the left-hand side, and you'll be able to see what things actually sell for and not just what people are asking for them and how often they sell. That's the best way to find any kind of vintage price or really anything.
Yep. It's not, that's okay, but that's an excellent point because a lot of people say, but I saw it listed on eBay for this price. No, it doesn't matter what it's listed for, it matters what the market is buying it for, so you do have to check the solds.
Right.
So I checked the solds on this guy, and it seemed like that was the fair price. But I thought, let me ask the lady if I can bargain her down and get a discount, because that's another tip for collectors. It never hurts to ask in an antique mall if they'll do a discount, because some antique malls will. So I took it up to the front and I said, look, I really want to buy this. Is there any discounts? What, can I work with the seller? And she said, oh yeah, let me text him. Guy messaged back. He said, well, will $150 work? And I said,
holy smokes.
Yeah, I'll take that. That's fine. A wonderful price. And I said, by the way, do you know where this came from? Do you know anything about, like, I was curious, how did this guy get a parking meter? That's a pretty random object,
Sure.
to get. And the guy messaged her back, the lady up at the front. He said, yeah, this lady backed over this parking meter in 1950 in New York, and she was so scared that I guess the police or something were going to come after her. So she threw it in the back of her son's truck, covered it up, drove away, and it's been in the family ever since. And he got it from this lady. So I now am the proud owner of a stolen parking meter from 1950, and I think that is the coolest story. So it wasn't actually a hunt that I had been pursuing for months, but it was something that found me, and it has such a cool story that I just had to have it.
Absolutely. That's so cool. And really, sometimes the story is the selling feature for me. Like, it is so fun or interesting to hear about what somebody else thought of, like, I'm sorry to keep bringing it back to cars, but last weekend I went on a walk with some friends in a botanical garden, and part of it was reserved for a wedding. And they brought the bride and groom in a Porsche Boxster. Granted, it was
so cool.
20 years newer than mine and in far better condition. But it got me thinking, like, I wonder if my car has ever been used for something like that. How cool of a story would that be? And I have 5 previous owners to call and ask. It's low mileage, but it's had a high turnover rate. And yeah, that's, everything that survived, as long as this stuff has at least one good story.
Yeah.
And that sometimes is such a compelling thing.
I always say a vintage could talk. Oh, the stories it could tell.
For sure. Yeah. That would be an interesting podcast. Like, it would be Toy Story, but it would be
with vintage
story. Oh my gosh. Is there a category of vintage that you respect the heck out of, but you just have absolutely no interest in owning yourself?
Yes, Fenton glass. A lot of people love Fenton glass. Fenton's a brand. They made a whole slew of glass. They make a lot of pretty art glass. They made ruffled little dishes. They made all kinds of things. And Fenton is wildly popular within many collecting circles. It can be kind of expensive when you get into some of the larger pieces and more unique pieces. And Fenton has an incredible history. But I just don't have an interest in collecting Fenton glass. I have one Fenton piece. It's the Fenton jadeite lotus bowl that belonged to my great-grandmother, and I do use that for serving in my kitchen. I think that's quite lovely. But I just don't have an interest really in the Fenton glass. I also am not a big collector of swung glass vases. A lot of people like those from the 50s. And while I appreciate them and think they're really cool, mid-century modern, I just don't have a love for that. I appreciate it in the realm of the fact that it's popular, and I would love to get some to sell because I know other people would love them, and I love the idea of finding things that can go into the right collector's hands.
Right.
I love finding that item that somebody gets from me and they say, wow, I've been looking for this, or, oh, this is the perfect thing for my collection. That makes me really happy. Even if I don't collect it myself. I know that it's going to a good home.
That's cool. All right, I'm going to ask the opposite question now. What is something that you think, I don't know if it really... What's your guilty pleasure? What's something that you may not respect so much, but you just can't help yourself? You just gotta...
Gotta have it.
An indulgence, I guess.
Man, that is a real stumper of a question. I guess, that's hard. I would say maybe milk glass mugs. I do have a small collection of those, and I like them because they're just the perfect coffee mug. They are perfectly shaped. The D handles on them are wonderful, And some of them are kind of tacky looking, if I'm being quite honest, because they have kind of funny sayings on some of them. Others of them are just cool because they've got a neat design. I love the ones that feature Snoopy. I just think those are so wonderful. But they really aren't something that I think is, it's not like the holy grail vintage item. Some people do collect just milk glass mugs, and there is probably some that they're like, oh, I would die to have that. But for me, that's kind of, when I see one, I'm like, oh, I gotta have that. They're just nice coffee mugs.
Right.
But that's a hard question to answer, that really is.
Yeah, I'm super impressed with your, actually, let's take a quick break for ads, for sponsors. And by that, I mean to double check that the mics are still working. Okay, we're groovy. We have literally nothing left showing on the display up there, but we're just going to keep rocking.
Oh, wait, is it off?
This display's on, but the battery icon is empty.
Well, we have to be very
we have
careful.
Minutes. I love that you are willing to use a bunch of this vintage in cooking for me tonight, and all around your lovely little apartment. You have functional uses for a lot of this stuff. It's not just squirreled away in some kind of storage or something like that. You really do enjoy it and get some use out of it. Is there was it always that way in your mindset? Like, oh, I want to put this on my my table or my countertop? Or was it more of like, oh wait, I can use this, and sorry, go ahead.
No, that's a wonderful question. I watched my grandmother collect things. She loves Hummels, and I watched a lot of her collections be put into a curio cabinet. And there's nothing wrong with that. They look absolutely lovely there. My grandma also had a wonderful collection of Spode, which is a type of china. They make the beautiful Christmas pattern with the little Santa on the top. And a lot of that, when it came from my grandparents' house, got stored in a box upstairs, and no one was really using it. And my mom, growing up, would always tell us about this poem by Irma Bombeck that basically talks about, I wish I had used the good candles. I wish I had gotten out the silver. I wish there's a whole list of things. It's a really beautiful poem. And I saw all these things sitting in a box or in a curio cabinet, and I kind of thought about that poem, and I thought, these things deserve to be used. Life is too short to let this just be in a cabinet and never touched. If you break it, it's not the end of the world. You can maybe find another one. There's more of them out there. And so I really enjoy using my items, and glassware is one of them. I have a whole collection of vintage Fostoria and Tiffin glass, and they're my everyday drinking glasses. And yes, they were designed to be fancy dinnerware glasses at a very fancy party back in the day. But I use them every day. Because
and guess what? You're worth it.
Yep, they're wonderful. And then the other thing that I use every day on my counter, and I'm a big fan of little jars, because you can use all of these wonderful vintage jars to store practical items. So on my counter, I have a Fostoria candy dish that I've turned into a holder for my dish pods, my dishwashing liquid. They're great. I enjoy opening. It gives me so much joy. I pull off the little lid, the little pods are in there. It's just wonderful. And same in my bathroom. I have a whole collection of vintage shaving jars where the shaving cream would come in. I've cleaned them, and they're great. I put my Q-tips in them, and I put other little things that I use. And I get so much pleasure opening the little jar every day, and you're using it. So live with your vintage, use it, love it. Don't squirrel it away. There's no reason to do that. It's survived all these years, and it will survive even more. And I'm sure that the people that owned it will love the fact that you're now taking it and using it and making it your own.
Yeah, absolutely. Who are you saving it for?
Exactly. Right. Just use it, enjoy it, love it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Is there something, are there things in your collection that could conceivably be practical, but you'd rather not? Is there anything too precious for you?
I do have a few things that I don't use every day because I am sort of afraid they get broken. I have my grandmother's Fostoria pitcher, my water pitcher. I love that piece to death, and so it sits just in my kitchen and it looks pretty, and I don't really use it that often. Of course, if I had a bigger dinner party, I actually probably would, but I'd be a little nervous, and people are as careful as they can be, but not as careful as you are, because you love the piece and you know how special it is. So I do kind of care about things like that. I may not use all the time, but pretty much everything else I use and I love and I enjoy.
That's excellent.
Records are one of those things too. I've seen a lot of record collectors that buy records and they leave them in the shrink and they never open them. And to me, that just defeats the purpose of collecting records.
Yeah.
That's another one of the many things that I collect.
Right. The other half, and I failed to mention, of her show and podcast is vintage and vinyl.
So yes, I do collect vinyl, but I have a lot of 50s records. That's my main love, an era of music that I enjoy. And there's a lot of 50s records that are hard to find now, and I have a few. I don't have as many as some collectors, but I enjoy listening to them. I'm not going to squirrel them away because this is rare, and if I scratch it, I've lost a $300 record. It's like, no, it's about the music, so enjoy it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I talked with my friend Kiana in a previous episode about the value of things that are not going to be there forever, right? And the fact that some of this stuff is fragile or requires a little bit of extra care, or that record is only going to play a certain number of times and then it will start sounding different or sounding worse. And that makes it so much more special each time you do play it. I think the mindset completely changes. You learn to cherish something instead of just squeezing it for all it's got, I guess.
And to take care of your things. If you take care of your things, they really will last. And I think my grandmother instilled that in me, and my mom too. But games were something that we played a lot of growing up. But one rule that we always had in our house was you could not get out another game until you put all the pieces back. And that is something that really just taught me to take care of your things. And we have never lost a game piece. The only thing that we lost was one antenna in the game Cootie. It got accidentally vacuumed up in the carpet, and we couldn't find it. It fell down and got caught in the pile of the carpet. But beyond that, we've not lost a single piece of a game, and that kind of taught me just to take care of your things. And if you care for your vintage glass by hand washing them, dishwasher damage is a real thing, you can really preserve the life of some of these vintage items and enjoy them for years to come.
That's awesome. Do you have anything that you are particularly excited to leave to your posterity? Is there anything from today that you would consider, okay, maybe this would be worthwhile in 50 years?
I think some of my cast iron cookware, it's more modern, but I think those kinds of things are wonderful because cast iron just gets better with age. And I think down the line, somebody might find value in a good seasoned cast iron pan.
Yeah, you can't beat it.
No. Fried turkey in it is just excellent.
That's cool. Is there anything that you would prefer to use modern instead of vintage? Like, you think, oh, I could use my vintage stuff in this case, but I actually would prefer what we've got today.
I don't know that there's much that I use that's modern, but I will say, I think with certain electronics, when it comes to vintage irons and things, the technology has gotten so much more advanced on those things that some people do actually still use their 1950s irons, and that is wonderful. They work beautifully.
Yeah.
But for me,
1950s vacuums are beast.
Yes.
They're out of control.
My grandma had a whole vacuum system in her house. You could plug up to any port on the floor in the upstairs or downstairs and hook up to a vacuum, and you could just it was amazing. Those things work so well. But
any value that you see in terms of retro design of modern stuff? And what I mean is, do you think it's even possible for companies today to be trying to emulate old styles and do a faithful job, or is that just kind of like a lost art now?
I see a lot of companies actually bringing back vintage design into their products because they're realizing that people like it. The flea market style is very, very popular. You see Chip and Joanna Gaines and all that stuff at Target. And Target is one place that you'll see a lot of vintage reproductions coming back. Jadeite for one, that green colored glass that everybody likes so much. Target did a whole reproduction line of that. And people really like that because it was a lot more affordable to buy the reproductions. Now, coming from a collector and someone that sells vintage, I personally don't care for the reproductions because in a lot of cases they're not marked, so it confuses other sellers, and they might find this at an estate sale and they might think that it's real, and they're listing it as real because they don't know any better, and it's not. And as someone that collects Coca-Cola trays, and I really like the originals, I find there's a lot of reproductions that aren't marked as reproductions, and they flood the market, and so a lot of people are listing, you know, the iconic Tarzan tray, as we all like to call it, with Johnny Weissmuller on it, listing it as an original, and then if you really look at the details, you can tell that, okay, those colors aren't right. They're kind of faded, so that's the reproduction. But for a new collector or someone that's just selling, it's really hard to tell all these things apart.
Sure.
So you have to know your details, and I think it's cool that companies are bringing back all of this vintage and they're getting this younger generation interested in these things. But I really have an issue when they're not marked as reproductions, and it kind of floods the market and confuses people. So I kind of have mixed feelings about that in that world.
Is an homage better? Something that's, you know, clearly modern but kind of hearkening back?
Yes. To me, that would be the way to go, is you have those elements of the vintage design and style, but it's definitely a modern piece. Or if you do a modern kind of copy of a vintage item, just mark it as a reproduction. Just put on the bottom, like, you know, Pyrex 2002 or something. That way that people
It doesn't have
know.
to say repro on the bottom.
On the bottom, but just put the date or something so people know, because it would help with a lot of the confusion and new collectors and people that just, you know, it's hard.
Is there a particular source or help that you can give to new collectors? Where would you point them if they had struggles to identify stuff?
You know, you just have to get out to the antique malls and feel the items themselves and really study the details, because that's how you're going to learn. You know, there's a lot of reproductions in certain glassware, and people will say, if you learn the certain curve of the F of Fostoria on this mark, or the certain curve of the F of Fenton, or whatever it is, you know, you can tell that that's an original. Or for the Coca-Cola trays, you're looking for the tiny little marks on the bottom of the tray that say, you know, Coca-Cola Company, then it says Coshocton, Ohio, American Artworks Inc., and then the date. So you're looking for that little detail. So it just kind of helps to study it and look at it. Also, research books are your best friend. If you can start picking up research books inexpensively, I have a whole bunch, and even though I may not collect Lefton or stoneware, if I can get that book at a good price, I pick them up. Thrift books is wonderful because you can go on there and find a lot of books, and by reading the books, you're learning. I mean, these are things that you can't really learn online. Sure, you can look things up, but sometimes, like with these tobacco tins, they're so rare that you wouldn't know they exist unless you saw them photographed in a book.
Right.
And it really helps to study them, you know, so get your books out, study, and talk to other collectors. You know, when you find someone that's been collecting, say, for 30 years, a particular item, and that's what you want to collect, get to know them, and they might be able to share like all the things that they've learned, and you get to see their collection, and it's really wonderful that way. So just, you know, network, go to your antique stores, feel the items, pick them up, study the details, and you'll start to learn, as you go along, and just have fun. Really, collecting is all about having fun and learning things along the way and having some great things in your house with wonderful stories.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Any tips on where a young collector might start first?
So, start by going to your estate sales and your vintage stores. Estate sales are wonderful because you never know what you're going to find. And I just love going on estatesales.net and looking in my area to see what estate sales are there. And they give pictures, and you can kind of line up early and try to get a particular item you're interested in. But, start by just finding things that interest you. There's so many vintage things to collect. It is amazing. You'd be surprised. Some people just collect pens, like vintage pens, so, like that you write with. Some people collect just vintage tools. Some people collect the lids off of old milk jars. If there is something to collect, people will find it, and it is fascinating. Like typewriter ribbon tins. Most people think, well, that's kind of an odd collection, but they're so cool. So just find something that interests you, meet other collectors, go to your estate sales, and just start kind of hunting things down,
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Where can people go to find you and see more of your collection, more of your items, and maybe some of the sales you have?
Thank you, David. This has been an excellent talk. I really enjoyed joining your podcast. It is so fun. You guys can find me over on YouTube at Vintage and Vinyl. I've got the ampersand on YouTube. And then on Instagram, I'm vintage_and_vinyl. And I've got lots of fun photographs of my collections over on Instagram. And I do weekly videos and live sales on YouTube. And now I'm also on Whatnot. So I've got a few sales on the Whatnot app as well. And I'll be scheduling my next sale very soon.
Cool. Catch you guys then. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Katie.
Bye, folks. It was wonderful.
Yep, and that is how vintage is one of the machines that make us more human.
Good job,
Not
David.
bad. Not bad.
I hope you were pleased with it.
Yes.